Hi, I'm Serena, and I did my oral history with my grandmother, Shauna Payne. For my podcast, I'm going to tell some stories from her teenage and young adult years and fit them into a larger narrative of American history. And today I'm joined by my older sister, Macy, so I can share grandma's story with her.
Hi.
So, first I'm going to give you a quick biography. As you know, Shauna was born in Idaho Falls, Idaho in 1952 to her two parents and her older brother.
Wasn't Idaho very Mormon?
Yes, so Idaho had and still has a very high concentrations of Mormons. So Shauna grew up in a very Mormon-dominated town, but interestingly, she herself was not Mormon. And we're going to come back to this later as we talk about how she resisted the norms that the community around her set.
Great. Sounds very interesting.
Yeah, so Shauna was upper middle class when she grew up because her parents owned a cattle ranch, and she attended public school her whole life. After high school, she attended Colorado Women's College for a year before getting married to her husband, our grandpa Chris. Chris was in the Navy, so after they got married, they moved to Charleston because that's where Chris was stationed. And in Charleston, Shauna had her first son, our dad Jason, while attending Charleston College part-time. Chris was away at sea for the majority of Jason's first few years of life, so Shauna had to balance raising a kid, getting education, and making money for the family.
But didn't they move to Eureka at one point?
Yes, she did. Great memory. So after living in Charleston, the Payne family moved to Eureka, California in 1973. There she attended College of the Redwoods and finally graduated with an AA in bookkeeping. And throughout all of that time, so around 1968 to 1974, Shauna mostly worked as a front office receptionist at various companies. And my own interview didn't go past Shauna's young adult life, so this is where the detailed biography is going to end. So let me tell you some historical facts so we can really contextualize what was going on in the world during Shauna's young adult years. I'm mainly going to focus on women's rights and agency for this podcast.
Okay, sound very important.
Yes. So the most important thing to know is that the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed in 1974. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So according to an article titled The Equal Credit Opportunity Act, an Evaluation by John R. Nevin and Gilbert A. Churchill from the Journal of Marketing, quote, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act made it illegal to discriminate in any aspect of a credit transaction on the basis of sex or marital status. Now, this is very important to note because it essentially meant that except for in very special circumstances, women were not allowed to own a credit card or open a bank account unless it was co-owned by a family member. And this is going to become more important later on in our story. And what I learned in my history class was that the 60s and 70s were very tumultuous times for women's rights, as there are many people on each side of the spectrum of support for women gaining rights. I actually read a really interesting piece of literature by Phyllis Schlafly, who wrote an essay in 1972 explaining why women are privileged don't have the same rights as men.
Wow, that's crazy. Women not having the same financial rights as men feels like so long ago, but that's actually the year both our parents were born.
I know, right?
So, what do you think Grandma's story shows about the larger historical time of the late 60s to early 70s?
That's a great question. I think that her story reflects the deeply personal, everyday fight for women's rights in the 1960s and 70s through her relentless pursuit of education and independence, defiance of societal gender norms, and her ultimate exercise of the growing freedoms granted by the ECOA despite limited agency.
That sounds very interesting. I'm eager to learn more.
Perfect. So we're going to focus on three main facets of Grandma's life and how she connects to the larger historical period: resistance, independence, and agency. So, I don't know if you know this, but Grandma was actually the editor of her school's yearbook when she was a senior, and this is one of the first ways that she showed resistance to standard norms. Growing up in a Mormon town, most of her peers did not agree with developing civil rights movements and giving women's rights because Shauna said that her Mormon peers believed that black people were the descendants of Cain from the Bible, and according to a book I read called Mormons, an Open Book, Mormon women praise motherhood over anything else, and those beliefs do not align with the radical feminist movements at the time.
So, Grandma was a little bit of an outcast because she wasn't Mormon and her beliefs didn't align with her peers.
Yes, so as a small act of resistance, she photocopied newspaper clippings reporting on world news and used them as page dividers in the yearbook. She got backlash for it though, but I think she felt like it was worth it. Here's a clip from an interview where she is referencing the people in her town and the growing civil rights movements.
Not something that they believed at where I was going to school, and it just seemed like my way of thumbing my nose at them.
This seems like such a small, almost petty thing to do, but definitely worth it.
For sure. I feel like the small act of resistance reflected a lot about the 60s, where change was made slowly from the ground up.
So, you mentioned that the Mormon girls praise motherhood over everything, right?
Yes, I did.
So, how were the girls at Grandma's school? Did they go to college?
That's a great question. Here's an audio clip that describes what the Mormons at her school were like and how they viewed college.
The goal was to graduate from high school and marry a return missionary and have a large family, somewhere between 6 and 10 kids. And that was their goal. That was the goal of all the women, all the girls that I went to high school with. And if they went to college, it was only to snag a returning missionary.
Wow, that seems very related to the Phyllis Schlafly text you mentioned earlier about how some women didn't really see the need for more rights. It seems like college was a no-go for most girls at the school.
Yes, and she also later mentioned that Mormon men would only go to BYU, which was the Mormon university, to avoid getting drafted to the Vietnam War.
That's really interesting that they only saw college as a means of getting a husband or avoiding the draft, not an opportunity for education.
Yeah, and that's where we see the other time that Grandma exercised resistance to strange beliefs that her community held, because she actually did go to college, as I mentioned before.
Yes.
So college was also the first time that Grandma left Idaho, and we see her have a lot of independence at this time. She dropped out of Colorado Women's College because she really didn't like it, and she met Grandpa and married him instead. But unlike many of the women from her high school who wanted to just settle down and have children, she continued to seek out education wherever in the world Grandpa's career took them.
So she was kind of a single mom at one point, correct?
Close. So as I mentioned earlier, Grandpa was in the Navy, so for a lot of Grandma's late teens and 20s, she was alone, which really grew her independence. She had to raise a child on her own while continuing to pursue education and providing for the family while Grandpa was away.
Wow, that seems like it would be really hard. On top of all of that, she couldn't even open a credit card or open a bank account under her name, right?
Yeah, great memory. So even though Grandma had all this amazing independence, because there were no laws protecting her, she didn't have access to a credit card or bank account without the help of a male family member.
That's so horrible. I can't believe that she would be denied that by banks. It seems like that would be especially hard for single, divorced, or widowed women, and definitely contributed to the institutional gender wealth gap we still see today.
Yeah, I read about exactly that in this article called Credit History. In the 1970s, a new law allowed women to establish their own credit. Fortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed in 1974, and it finally barred credit discrimination based on gender, marital status, race, and age.
Wow, it took quite a while, but it's great that they passed that law. I bet Grandma really enjoyed having that as an independent mom.
She did. Here's an audio clip from her interview of her sharing that.
I couldn't have individual ownership without his name on it. I could earn the money for all three of us so that we could eat and pay the rent, but his name had to be, if we had a credit card, his name had to be on that credit card. And that law changed, and I went and got my credit card in my own name, and I've never given it up.
Wow, so she really took advantage of the limited agency she did have before the law was passed, and enjoyed it when she finally did have more rights.
And she's not the only one. I read a Smithsonian article of 4 oral histories of women who were also impacted in some way by the ECOA, and they were all similar in some way to Grandma. It seems like it wasn't just a law passed in a courtroom, but it really did benefit so many women all over the United States.
It's so cool that Grandma got to experience such a pivotal and beneficial time for women's rights, and that we still get to learn from her stories.
Yes, but there's still a lot of limitations to her story that I think we should talk about.
Well, yes. This is just the story of one woman, and I'm sure it doesn't represent all the people or women of her time.
Exactly. She also grew up in a place with almost no people of color, and her beliefs were pretty narrow when she left. Although she's a very open-minded person now, her story still lacks information surrounding people of color. Adding on to that, her feminist story is a very mild version of feminism, as she grew up around many anti-feminists. The worldview at the time was limited, along with her racial, socioeconomic, religious, and geographical experience. And Grandma has a very good memory, but I'm sure some of her memory is distorted due to the fact that most of these events happened upwards of 50 years ago.
Well, I'm sure she also only shared what she believed would be appropriate for her 16-year-old granddaughter to hear. I wonder how her story would differ if she was talking to someone else, or if she wasn't being recorded.
That's a great wonder. Despite these limitations, I think that Grandma's story is a great reflection of exercising agency, breaking out of predetermined norms, and taking advantage of newfound rights during the 1960s and 70s.
The resistance that she showed in her high school by editing her yearbook together with controversial news and contradicting the future aspirations of most of the girls at her school is pretty inspiring.
I also love that she exercised so much agency between being an independent mom to really taking advantage of the new freedoms that the ECOA granted her.
You can really see how the small parts of her interview all add up to a larger story of the deeply personal fight for women's rights that people like her went through every day.
Yeah, it really represents a lot of women during the 60s and 70s, as I read in my Smithsonian oral histories.
I love how her story serves as a reminder that the women's rights that we enjoy today didn't happen too long ago, and we should really try to uphold and continue fighting for them today.
Yeah, for me, it really humanized all the history I've been learning, and it was a really good insight into the personal impact that women's rights legislation had and still have on women.
Thanks for sharing Grandma's story with me.
Thank you for listening.